If you were a noble in medieval Europe, the most precious thing on your dinner table wasn't gold, silver, or fine wine. It was a pinch of black dust. A handful of peppercorns could buy a sheep. A small pouch of cinnamon could pay a month's rent. And a few threads of saffron, lighter than air, were guarded as if they were treasure from heaven itself. But why? Why did medieval Europeans become so obsessed with spices? Things so small, so simple, and so far from home. Tonight, we'll wander through the quiet kitchens, the candlelit halls, and the crowded spice markets of a world that believed flavor could touch the divine. You'll learn how cinnamon, pepper, and nutmeg shape not just meals, but medicine, religion, and the course of global trade itself. So close your eyes and let's step back into the slow, fragrant world of medieval Europe, where every meal whispered of paradise, and every spice told a story older than time. Why medieval people loved spices so much. If you could travel back to the 13th century and walk through the heart of a medieval city, say Venice or Bruges, you would not need a map to find the spice market. You could simply follow your nose. Before you saw the goods, before you heard the cries of the traders or the clatter of hooves on the cobblestones, you would smell the air itself, thick, layered, and fragrant with things that had come from impossibly far away. Cinnamon and pepper, ginger and cloves, nutmeg and saffron. It was a perfume of the world condensed into a few narrow streets. In those days, spices were not merely flavors. They were treasures, rarer than gold, lighter than silk, and more desirable than almost anything else one could own. To have a handful of peppercorns was to hold in your palm a small measure of global wealth. To see saffron, bright as sunlight, thin as hair, was to glimpse a color more valuable than silver. These tiny, aromatic things seemed to come from another realm entirely. To medieval Europeans, they were pieces of paradise itself. The fascination was not only about taste, it was about imagination. For most people living in medieval Europe, the world beyond their own village, castle, or town was an abstraction, known only through the Bible, travelers' tales, or the hearsay of merchants. But spices were physical proof that somewhere out there, beyond the deserts and the seas, life was different. They came wrapped in mystery. And mystery, in an age that feared and revered the unknown, was intoxicating. There were stories about where these spices came from, fantastical stories, repeated in monasteries and royal courts alike. One tale claimed that cinnamon grew in the nests of giant birds who built high in the mountains of Arabia. To gather it, brave men would toss heavy chunks of meat at the nests, causing them to break apart when the birds swooped down to seize the bait. The fallen cinnamon would then be collected from the ground. Another legend said that pepper grew in valleys guarded by dragons, and that the berries turned black only after the beasts set them aflame. In a world without maps, myths filled the void where geography could not reach. By the early Middle Ages, Europe's appetite for spice had already begun to reshape trade and politics. The Romans had once imported pepper from India, but after their empire fractured, the trade routes fell into disrepair. For centuries, spices became scarce luxuries. Their presence had a feast, a whisper of the past glories of Rome. But beginning in the Venetian 11th and 12th centuries, as Europe reconnected with the East through the Crusades and the growing power of Italian maritime cities, the spice trade revived and exploded. Venice was at the heart of it all. The city's merchants struck deals with Arab traders in Alexandria and Constantinople, buying spices from India and the islands of Indonesia through long, intricate networks that crossed the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger flowed westward in exchange for silver, gold, and fine cloth. Venice became rich, fabulously so, and the rest of Europe grew jealous. Genoa, Pisa, and other cities tried to muscle into the business, but Venice's position was nearly unbeatable. Its warehouses glowed with the scent of distant lands, and its merchants became the quiet princes of Europe's dinner tables, spices traveled slowly, and with each stage of their journey, their price rose. A handful of nutmeg that might cost a few copper coins in the Moluccas, today's Maluku Islands in Indonesia, would sell for many times its weight in gold by the time it reached London or Paris. This inflation wasn't merely the product of greed. It reflected the astonishing complexity of the trade. Ships carried the goods from India to Arabia. Caravans hauled them across deserts. Merchants in Cairo and Damascus negotiated in crowded bazaars. And finally, Venetian galleys bore them across the Mediterranean to Europe's ports. Every step risked loss, storms, theft, disease, and every risk demanded profit in return. But for the nobles, the clergy, and the wealthy merchants who could afford them, spices were worth any cost. They added them to nearly everything: roasted meats, stews, pies, pastries, even wine. A well-spiced dish was a display of refinement, a performance of power. To offer guests a meal fragrant with cinnamon and clove was to show not only taste but connection, proof that you, somehow, were linked to the great, mysterious world beyond Europe's borders. It is tempting to imagine that people used spices simply because food tasted dull in those days, or because meat was often spoiled and needed disguising. But that is only partly true. Medieval cooks had plenty of access to salt, vinegar, and fresh herbs. Their food, by their own standards, was vibrant. The deeper reason for spices' allure was symbolic and medical. According to the dominant medical theory of the time, inherited from the ancient Greek physician Galen, the human body was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on balancing these humors, and food was one of the main tools for achieving that balance. Spices were classified by their qualities: hot, cold, dry, or moist, and each was prescribed to balance a particular temperament or season. Pepper and ginger were warming, good for the cold months or for those with sluggish, melancholic humors. Cinnamon was both warming and soothing, thought to calm the stomach and heart. Cloves were strong and stimulating. Nutmeg was believed to purify the air and even ward off the plague. To eat spice, then, was not only to enjoy a flavor, but to participate in a kind of medicine, a daily ritual of health. There was also a deeply spiritual element. In monasteries, where monks followed strict rules of diet and abstinence, spices played a role in the rhythm of holy days. On feast days, perhaps Christmas, Easter, or the celebration of a saint, the usually simple meals would be transformed by the addition of imported spices. Cinnamon in the wine, saffron in the bread, ginger in the broth. These were reminders of divine abundance, of the paradise described in Scripture, where every tree bore fruit and every breeze carried sweetness. In a world defined by hardship and penance, spices were a taste of heaven. Among the nobility, however, spices became a language of class. To dine with heavy seasoning was to dine with prestige. Recipes from the courts of France and England show a lavish hand with the spice jar. Meat pies might contain half a dozen different spices, along with sugar, vinegar, and dried fruit. Stews were often sweetened and spiced in ways that would seem strange to a modern palate, a combination of savory and sugary, hot and floral. The goal was not simplicity or contrast, but balance and spectacle. The more intricate the blend, the greater the host's reputation. The symbolism of spice extended beyond the table. It entered the language of love, politics, and religion. Spices were used in perfumes and ointments, in medicines and church incense. The same cinnamon that flavored a noble's dinner might also be burned in a cathedral or mixed into a salve for the sick. In the great trading cities, the smell of spices was everywhere, seeping from the warehouses, clinging to the robes of merchants, drifting from the apothecaries' shops. It was a scent that meant power, wealth, and connection to the divine. Yet, for all their popularity, the origins of these exotic goods remained shrouded in mystery. Few Europeans had ever seen a pepper vine, a clove tree, or a nutmeg fruit. The journey to their sources was long, dangerous, and poorly understood. Geography was an art of guesses, and maps often blended fact with imagination. The lands that produced these wonders were drawn at the very edges of the known world, labeled with strange beasts and warnings. The idea of traveling there was almost unthinkable, and yet, the desire to control the spice trade became one of the driving forces of European expansion. The medieval hunger for pepper and cinnamon would, in time, inspire voyages that changed the world. But in the centuries before Columbus and da Gama, the spice routes were the lifeblood of an interconnected economy stretching from Java to London. At the bottom of this system were the producers, farmers in India, Sri Lanka, and the islands of Indonesia who tended the trees and vines that bore the world's most prized flavors. They lived in a rhythm unchanged for centuries, harvesting by hand, drying the spices in the sun, and packing them for traders who came from distant ports. Above them were the middlemen, Arab, Persian, and Indian merchants who carried the goods along well-established routes through the Indian Ocean. Their ships, called dhows, followed the monsoon winds, sailing west with one season and east with another. The ports they visited, Calicut, Aden, Alexandria, became the crossroads of civilization, where languages, religions, and currencies mixed freely. When the spices reached Europe, they passed through many hands. Venetian and Genoese merchants dominated the Mediterranean trade, selling to German, Flemish, and English merchants who then carried the goods north. By the time a few ounces of nutmeg reached a noble's kitchen in Paris, its price had multiplied many hundreds of times. But the cost only added to its mystique. Spice was wealth made visible, and people were willing to pay dearly for the right to display it. It is easy to imagine that this fascination was entirely material. But it wasn't. Medieval people saw the world through a lens that combined faith and curiosity in equal measure. To them, the fact that spices came from distant lands was itself a sign of divine order, proof that God had filled the earth with marvels waiting to be discovered. A chronicler of the 14th century wrote that the taste of pepper is the heat of the sun made solid, and others believed that nutmeg grew only in places where paradise once touched the earth. To eat such things was to partake, however faintly, in the wonder of creation. Of course, not everyone shared equally in this luxury. For the vast majority of Europeans, peasants, laborers, and villagers, spices were distant dreams. Most people cooked with local herbs like parsley, sage, and garlic. A peasant's stew might contain barley, onions, and cabbage, seasoned with a bit of salt if they could afford it. The great ships of Venice and Genoa were as far from their lives as the moon. And yet, even in the humblest households, the idea of spices circled down. A pinch of imported pepper might be bought for a special occasion, or a tiny vial of cinnamon saved for a wedding feast. These moments were small glimpses of the world beyond their fields. In many ways, spice was one of the first truly global commodities. It connected continents long before the concept of globalization existed. The demand from Europe influenced economies and politics across Asia and Africa. Kings and sultans competed for control of spice ports. Merchants became diplomats and spies. Every grain of pepper carried within it the story of this vast invisible web, a network of ships, deserts, and empires bound together by human desire. As centuries passed, the spice trade shaped even the course of exploration. When Europeans eventually grew tired of paying Venetian prices, they began to dream of reaching the source themselves. Portuguese navigators sailed south along Africa's coast, seeking a sea route to India. Their ambition was not gold, nor glory, nor souls, not at first. It was spice. Columbus's own voyage westward was financed in part by the promise of finding a new route to the Spice Islands. In a quiet way, the medieval hunger for pepper and cinnamon lit the fuse that would lead to the Age of Discovery. But before all that, in the centuries when Europe still slept beneath the weight of its cathedrals and castles, Spices remained a rare, shimmering link to the unknown. They touched every aspect of life: medicine, religion, trade, and art, and their scents filled the dreams of merchants and monks alike. To hold a pinch of saffron was to hold sunlight. To smell cinnamon was to inhale the air of distant lands. To taste pepper was to taste the warmth of the world. Perhaps what made spices so enchanting was not just their flavor, but their promise. They spoke of connection in a fragmented world, of movement in an age of stillness. A merchant could stand in his counting house in Bruges and imagine ships unloading. In Alexandria, caravans crossing the deserts of Arabia, and farmers tending their groves beneath the tropical sun. A monk in England could open a small jar of nutmeg and be reminded that God's creation was vast and mysterious. A noble woman in Paris could sprinkle cinnamon into her wine and imagine herself part of something infinite, even as Europe changed. As empires rose and fell, as wars came and went, the love of spice endured. It was more than fashion. It was a kind of continuity, a thread that connected the medieval world to the ancient and eventually to the modern. In every era, people sought the same thing: warmth, comfort, and a sense of wonder carried by the simplest of things. If you close your eyes, you can almost smell it: the faint sweetness of cinnamon, the sharp sting of pepper, the earthy richness of clove. You can imagine a medieval kitchen, its hearth glowing, the cook leaning over a steaming pot, sprinkling in a blend of spices brought from the ends of the earth. Outside, the streets are dark, the city asleep, the air cold. But inside, the warmth and fragrance of the dish promise something beyond survival. They promise life's richness, its endless curiosity, and that is why medieval people loved spices so much. Not because they needed them, but because they believed in them. In their scent and color and taste, they found a reminder that the world was wider than their fears, deeper than their knowledge, and more beautiful than they could ever see. Spices turned the act of eating into an act of wonder, a quiet communion with the distant and the divine, and perhaps, in some ways, that has never really changed. Even now, when cinnamon and pepper sit cheaply on our shelves, their fragrances still reach across centuries. The same scents that once drifted through the halls of kings and abbeys now fill our kitchens. The same warmth that soothed the bodies of medieval diners now comforts us too. History has grown louder since then, faster, more crowded, more complex, but the gentle mystery of spice endures, reminding us that sometimes the smallest things hold the longest stories. So if you ever open a jar of nutmeg or sprinkle pepper on your meal, pause for a moment. Breathe it in. Somewhere beneath that familiar aroma lies the memory of ships and deserts, of merchants and monks, of faraway lands and quiet dreams. The long, slow story of why medieval people loved spices so very much. And that was the quiet story of how a handful of spices changed the way medieval Europe tasted, traded, and even dreamed. If you're still awake, I hope you learned something small but wonderful tonight. And if you drifted off somewhere between the pepper ships and the cinnamon merchants, that's perfectly fine too. That's exactly what quiet, boring sleep is here for. If you enjoyed this calm journey through history, please take a moment when you wake up to subscribe, and maybe even share it with someone who loves slow, peaceful stories too. Your support helps keep these quiet corners of history alive. One sleepy story at a time. Thank you for listening, and good night from Quiet, Boring Sleep.